10. Hi! Captain on deck! What's going on, guys? I'm Joe, and today I'm here to start a series of Captain America reviews leading up to Civil War later this week. Today I'm going to be talking about the First Avenger, and I'll have a review for you, a more in-depth review of the Winter Soldier pretty soon. I'll try to get it up sometime this week before Friday. And also, I'm going to be concluding it with a special Spider-Man video. I'm going to leave that a little surprise for you. I've been planning that for a month or so. So today, let's start off with Captain America the First Avenger. Now, I have reviewed this before. Those of you who may not know, if you haven't been following me for a while, I did a series of Marvel Cinematic Universe movie reviews. I summed it up in Phase 1 and Phase 2. I covered this as briefly as I could leading up to Age of Ultron, but I want to try to go a little more in depth with the First Avenger. So, let's give it a whirl, shall we? Captain America the First Avenger is directed by Joe Johnston, starring Chris Evans, Haley Atwell, Hugo Weaving, Sebastian Stan, Stanley Tucci, and Tommy Lee Jones, and Toby Jones. The Joneses. And there's going to be spoilers in this video for those of you who haven't seen The First Avenger by now. If you haven't seen it by now, go watch the movie first, and then you can come back and watch this video. Those of you who have seen it and want to know my thoughts, let's get started. The movie takes place in the 1940s during the Second World War, where Steve Rogers, played by Chris Evans, is a really scrawny young guy who has made 5 attempts to try to get into the United States Army, to fight for his country, feeling a sense of responsibility, and is turned down because of his size. And over in Europe, there's a secret Nazi organization called Hydra, led by Johann Schmidt, played by Hugo Weaving, who wants to search for an ancient artifact that could give him the power and wipe out anybody that stands in their way, or they see as a threat to Hydra. Steve Rogers is recruited by Dr. Abraham Erskine, who sees the passion in him, and decides to recruit him into the Super Soldier Serum program, along with the help of Agent Peggy Carter, played by Haley Atwell, and with the skepticism of Colonel Chester Phillips, played by Tommy Lee Jones. Now, as far as my history with Captain America, I knew who the character was, but I wasn't really that well versed in the comics, and I still am not really that well versed. And at the time I saw this movie, I wasn't really following the Marvel Cinematic Universe at that point. I didn't even know that this was meant to be in the same universe as Iron Man or Thor. I just thought it was just some standalone movie. And when I saw this, I really enjoyed myself. I was really surprised and had a really good time with this movie. And gone back and watching it again recently, I still think this is a really fun time. It's not a perfect movie though. There are a couple of things that kind of hold it down a little bit. And I think the second one is the best one of the Captain America movies so far. But that being said though, I still have a really good time with this one. Now, where do we begin with this? Chris Evans as Captain America, Steve Rogers. This is something that a lot of people were really skeptical about at first, because before in the past, he was known for playing the Human Torch or Johnny Storm in the Fantastic Four. I think most people will agree that he was the highlight of that series. I read that a lot of people were flipping out over this. They didn't like the idea of Chris Evans being Captain America because of how those Fantastic Four movies turned out, so they figured that he was just going to ruin the whole movie. But I have to say, I think a lot of those naysayers shut the heck up almost immediately when they saw this movie, because he really is terrific as Steve Rogers. I don't know the character personally outside of the movies. Captain America, from what I understand, is a really big Boy Scout kind of character. He's very patriotic, stands for good, and just wants to fight for his country. Some people don't really like that, and I know a couple people in real life that don't really like that kind of person. They think he's hard to relate to. I get why they would feel that way, but I like a character like that because it gives you someone to look up to, and he's the kind of guy, I mean, Steve Rogers is a fictional character, I know, but that's the kind of guy that I would like to be. Has a very strong moral compass and will give up and maintain a sense of optimism in a world that doesn't really feel the same. And a lot of people might have a problem with his need to serve his country, and because it's something that you don't usually see nowadays. Very few people do want to serve their country, and me serving in the military, I wanted to do something worthwhile. But during this time period, I think it really fits, because hearing from a few World War II veterans who fought back then, something was wrong with you if you weren't in the service back then. You were kind of frowned upon. And considering the Nazis and the Japanese that had started World War II, it made sense for feeling a sense of purpose to go and stop those bullies. And as Steve Rogers says to Abraham Erskine's character when he asks him, "Do you want to kill Nazis?" And he says,
"I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from."
And speaking of that, Dr. Abraham Erskine is a German scientist who sees the potential in Steve Rogers, which he says, we've had the big guys sent overseas. Maybe what we need is a little guy. And Stanley Tucci, he's usually that one actor in a movie where if it's not that good, usually he's the bright spot. But luckily, he's got a good movie in here to back him up. And he's really good here as Dr. Abraham Erskine. Sorry, I'm gonna stop with the German accent. At least I'll try. And you understand why he chooses Steve Rogers for the super soldier serum. And he makes him promise, right the night before the experiment, you'll have to promise me one thing, that you will be a good man and stay as a good man. And he also tells him that Steve Rogers is somebody who he recognizes, who recognizes the value of power and strength, and will use it as a force for good, as opposed to Johann Schmidt, who has a passion for power, but wants it as a means for evil purposes. Haley Atwell as Agent Peggy Carter is also really good too. There's not a whole lot to her character. I haven't watched Agent Carter yet, just the one episode, but I'm sure that her character gets more fleshed out in that series. But in this movie, I think it's fine. Like Abraham Erskine, she sees something in Steve Rogers that she finds really admirable. And not to mention, she is very nice to look at. Anyway, I gotta move on here. I'm getting carried away. And Tommy Lee Jones as the Colonel... He's great. Get your ass up out of that dirt and stand at attention until somebody tells you otherwise. Yes, sir! And arguably the best scene in the whole movie is when he and Dr. Abraham Erskine are talking about Steve Rogers and how he doesn't feel comfortable with Steve Rogers being so skinny and how he struggles with the physical fitness. And Dr. Abraham Erskine says, I'm looking for qualities beyond the physical. But look at Hotch. He's in shape, he obeys orders, he's a soldier, he's a bully. You don't win wars with kindness, Colonel. You win wars with guts. And he throws a dummy grenade out. He goes, grenade! And everybody dives for cover. But Steve Rogers lands right on top of it. Yeah, the irony. And you see the look on the Colonel's face. I just go, you were saying, Colonel? And Abraham Erskine has the same look. But Tommy Lee Jones just goes, he's still skinny. He just doesn't want to admit that he was wrong. Or right, whatever. Now, since I mentioned Captain America's sense of patriotism and Boy Scout demeanor, and I gotta give credit to Marvel, though. They have the courage to go all the way with his Boy Scout patriotism. Like, he practically wears it on his sleeves and is not sorry for wearing it. Sometimes the angry, brooding kind of character doesn't always work. Sometimes you need someone who can be an example for good. And I think you can relate to Steve Rogers. We all want to do the right thing on some level, don't we? And to maintain a sense of optimism in a world that's very pessimistic, I can relate to that. Some people might argue that Captain America's not supposed to be relatable. Maybe not entirely like someone like Peter Parker. But I think in some way you can relate to him because, like I said, he's trying to maintain a sense of optimism and he wants to do what's right. Now let's talk about Hugo Weaving as Johann Schmidt. He is probably one of the better villains we've had in the MCU. A lot of the MCU villains aren't really as good as someone like Loki or the Kingpin, but probably because of Hugo Weaving, he's got a lot of charisma, and he's got a lot of great lines in here too. You are failing! We fought to the last man. Evidently not. And his motivation, as I said earlier, wanting to control certain kind of power from the gods and use it for his own means. You can kind of see why he wants to do it. He's entranced by that idea of power. But I think maybe they could have put a little more emphasis on that motive, which I think he's not quite as compelling as he should be. But then again, it's Hugo Weaving. He kind of makes it somewhat watchable. Nevertheless, I really enjoy watching Hugo Weaving as the Red Skull in this movie. And speaking of that, the Red Skull effects were fantastic. It looks real. It's like, I don't know how to describe it, but watching it recently, I can't be sure exactly, but I'm pretty sure that was a real makeup effect. It looks like an actual skull because of the nose cover and everything. Then you got other supporting characters in here like Arnim Zola, Howard Stark, Tony Stark's dad, James Buchanan Barnes, or Bucky, played by Sebastian Stan, who is Steve Rogers' childhood friend. And I wish we could have maybe just gotten a little bit more screen time with their friendship, but with him standing up for Steve Rogers in that alley fight and the other interactions they have over the course of this movie, you do get a good sense of how they're really close friends and they care about each other, which I think makes it a little bit impactful when he dies in that train fight in the mountains, which of course we know how that leads into the second movie, which we'll talk about that soon. Speaking of action, Joe Johnston, who directed this movie, he's known for movies like The Rocketeer, October Sky, Jumanji, and Jurassic Park 3. Not the best movie ever, but he's clearly a director who knows how to bring really fun action sequences into a film. Look at his movies like Jumanji, or even Jurassic Park 3 if you're not a big fan of it. He brings this really good Indiana Jones vibe to this whole thing. Indiana Jones is a very period piece kind of film, and since he was a producer and I think an art director for Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I think he even worked on the original Star Wars movies at one point, he clearly understands how to make it look like you're set in the 1940s, and everything just looks great. You buy that you're in the 1940s. It doesn't feel flashy, doesn't feel fake or anything. You feel like you're actually there with the clothes, the cars, the way the buildings look, and the way people interact with each other back then. And probably some of the best action scenes in this movie is when Steve Rogers is finally turned into a super soldier, which, speaking of that, the effects on Chris Evans before he turned into Captain America, visually it's really great to look at. There are a couple times though where it does look a little awkward, like say when he first meets Dr. Abraham Erskine in the doctor's office. It looks a little too fake, but other than that, it looks really good. And I think I read somewhere they visually reduced Chris Evans' body and tried to make him look like he was that small. I don't know how Marvel does it, but clearly they know how to do good CGI effects. But back to the action. The scene where Steve Rogers chases that Hydra agent through Brooklyn after he assassinates Abraham Erskine, that's a lot of fun and has some really funny moments, like when he goes to save the kid, but then the kid goes, "Go get him! I can swim!" And also the train sequence in the mountain, which Jeremy Johns pointed this out in his review of the movie, reminded me of Uncharted in some ways, where you see that big guy in the black suit with those big miniguns. Watching it recently, I just went, this is kind of like Uncharted 2. And I found myself reciting some of the lines from that sequence from Uncharted 2. And the musical score by Alan Silvestri is just great. I love the main theme he composed for this character. In its similar fashion to John Williams' score for Superman, Danny Elfman's score for Spider-Man, and Hans Zimmer's music for Batman, it's one of those musical scores that speaks that character, where you listen to it and you know exactly what that's about. When I hear this score, I know that it's Captain America. Because when it goes da 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 da, it sounds like it's going Captain America. It just makes you want to march with pride and do the salute. Now, I mentioned earlier with Johann Schmidt or Red Skull finding the Tesseract to power up his weapons for Hydra. This is something a lot of people complain about, that it has to tie into Thor or that it has to tie into the Avengers. I don't really get annoyed by tie-ins that easily, and particularly in this movie. I mean, the way the film ends up, it does feel a little bit tacked on, but as far as this connection to Thor with the Tesseract, I think it makes sense. It does feed in to the First Avengers, where they all have to bond over something to fight against Loki. Personally, I wasn't too bothered by that tie-in to Thor. Now, since I mentioned the lead into the Avengers, the second half in comparison to the first half doesn't feel quite as strong as the first half. The first half is an origin story, which actually would make a really good movie, but then once he saves the prisoners, it feels like the movie doesn't know where to quite go after that, and they kind of montage through certain things that Captain America does in his service in Europe with his team. And speaking of that, I wish they would have gotten a little more screen time, like Dum Dum Dugan, played by Neil McDonough, who's also known as Lieutenant Buck Compton from Band of Brothers, and he's on Arrow Season 4 right now. You know what, Fritz? One of these days, I'm gonna have a stick of my own. And how it ends up with him getting on the plane to stop the Red Skull from dropping bombs onto the United States, I felt that was maybe a little too quick just to get him into the Avengers, and since Peggy Carter just kind of kissed him at the end, although, I mean, I don't really blame her for being in love with him because, you know, she sees something good in him that she respects, and maybe the kind of guy that she wants to be with. I just wish we could have gotten a little more screen time, but nevertheless, it's still a really well done finale, I think, when he has to sacrifice himself to stop the plane from dropping the bombs on the city. And when he says goodbye to Peggy, it's actually a little sad, especially when he wakes up in the future, which, at the time when I was seeing this, I didn't know what exactly was going on, because he wakes up in this room, and this lady comes in, looking like a woman from the 1940s, and there's a game playing on the radio, and he goes, "Where am I really? I don't understand. The game. From 1941. I know, because I was there." And the way the music cues up and you see the look on the woman's face, you just go, what's going on here? And then she pushes a button that she's holding right behind her back, and these two guys walk in. He kicks them out, and he starts running out the door. And out he goes into the streets of New York. And you see that it's our current modern time of New York City. And watching that happen, I just went, what the hell? And then he's cornered in Times Square by who turns out to be S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, and Nick Fury appears and tells him, "You've been asleep, Cap, for almost 70 years. And the final line, which Nick Fury and Steve Rogers say to each other, "You gonna be okay?" "Yeah, I had a date." Oh, man. Poor bastard. Overall, I really like this movie. I mean, the second half does kind of drag the movie down a little bit, but this, I think, in a lot of ways is a love letter to the Captain America character. And I think Joe Johnston overall did a really good job of introducing today's audiences to someone like Captain America. And if you're a fan of Marvel, if you're a fan of Captain America, you might like this movie. The sequel, though, is a lot better, and we'll talk about that very soon. What did you guys think of the First Avenger? Did you like it? Did you hate it? Comment below and tell me what you thought, and I'll see you guys next time for The Winter Soldier.